Hello, you're watching the Astrology Channel. I'm Kyle Pierce. I'm here with Joe G.
Hello, hello. I am Joe G.
That's Joe G. I'm Kyle Pierce. And we're going to we're talking about Jupiter and Gemini.
Yes, Jupiter and Gemini, the lord of many things and the sign of many things. Yes, let's go.
For those of you who have not met my friend Jupiter, please allow me to introduce him. He is the ruler of the fire sign Sagittarius and the water sign Pisces, and you can often find him hanging with his crew, fellow daytime planets, the Sun and Saturn. Our friend Jupiter serves as the bestower of blessings for the daytime. So if you want to understand what Jupiter does, all you really need to do is think about what sort of good things can happen to you related to your daytime activities. Daytime is usually when we work, when we operate out in the world. It's business hours. So Jupiter, the guy you want to meet when you're out doing those kinds of things, and what kind of guy is that? A guy with the hookups, a guy who can get you a new job, get you a raise, expose you to a new philosophy which makes you hate your life less, but also keeps things stable in the daytime world. In order for us to operate in a coherent, civilized manner, we need to share a common set of beliefs, to see the people around us as one of our own, as a group that we belong to. Jupiter wants to bring people together into a unit, one that is gathered under a common interest, common purpose. Jupiter's the great unifier. One of the ways that we've gone about unifying people throughout history is through faith or religion, belief systems which, by and large, attempt to place human experience within an overarching grand narrative. Jupiter wants to place human experience within a greater context, one which is far too large for us to fully understand as individuals or to be able to point to and see. Hey, did you hear about that guy God? He's going to save us one day. Where is he? Oh, I don't know. I think he lives up in the sky somewhere. That's why Jupiter rules over the idea of faith, the ability to believe in the truth of something which is unprovable. And this is closely related to the idea of optimism, which is often ascribed to Jupiter. And what is optimism but the belief that things are generally going to work out to yours and everyone else's favor? And it's easy to be optimistic when you're Jupiter because Jupiter is a lucky guy. Jupiter wants to create positive outcomes wherever he has influence on your life. And while Jupiter enjoys a good celebratory bash from time to time, it is, after all, one of the things that makes people happy, gathering together and celebrate their good fortune to be here on Earth, but the libations are more of a Venus thing. She's the fun things you do at night. And while Venus likes to loosen people up with lubricants, both social and otherwise, Jupiter is of a temperate nature. To create unity internally and externally, you need to sort of bring things towards the middle, where they're safe and stable, from which point you can go forth and multiply. Part of what Jupiter's role is to teach his wise ways. Jupiter is wisdom, knowledge multiplied by context. Knowledge which fits into a wider, coherent framework. Jupiter gives you a lot of the more subtle forms of knowledge, which are not easily detectable and only more readily gleaned from the vantage of a wider perspective or higher view. While Jupiter tries to do all these things, wherever he is, some signs are more supportive of Jupiter's natural inclinations than others. So if we want to gain wisdom and a wider perspective on what to expect from Jupiter in Gemini this year, we should include within our understanding the nature of the sign it finds itself in, which is Gemini. Gemini is the daytime home of Mercury. It is an air sign. As an air sign, we're moving towards something rather lighter and less affectatious than fire signs like Sagittarius, but also more free-flowing and less attached than a water sign like Pisces. And by temperament, air signs like Gemini are attributed with the quality of wetness and heat. Heat elevates like air. Wetness facilitates the transference of things. And being of a hot and wet nature, air signs are associated with a sanguine temperament. Just easygoing, social, generally positive and mobile, and, high up. Kind of like Jupiter. And Jupiter is associated with the sanguine temperament as well. So we have a bit of a suggestion that Jupiter might like it in air signs. And in fact, Jupiter is given a form of essential dignity known as triplicity in air and fire signs, elements which facilitate Jupiter's preferred mode of action quite nicely. But if we take a closer look at Gemini's position within the zodiac, Gemini is opposed to one of Jupiter's domiciles, Sagittarius. And when planets are in the signs opposite to their homes, they are considered to be in a condition of exile. They're far from home, and there's something about it that they don't like. It's foreign. It's different. Gemini is associated with the constellation of the twins, which introduces us to this idea of splitting or dividing. In order to gain a perspective, we move away from Taurus, which is about, stability and comfort, sustainability, while Gemini is interested in variety, the light, effervescent air sign. We depart from the solid, stable Earth to go in search of new and different things. So Gemini is experimental. It is inherently curious and interested in exploring different ways of organizing reality, movement, objects, for the sheer pleasure of seeing what happens. So Gemini likes to mix it up, combine things, take them apart, put them back together again. Sew butts on people's faces and faces on people's butts, right? Just for the fun of it. Gemini is playful. Playful in the sense that it's generally not too serious. It's not, by nature, overly interested in having massive impact. While Gemini will eventually want to see how things physically work, it's very often content to stay in a more theoretical space. A space of the mind, a space of abstraction where we can explore through the mind and explore different possibilities in a much faster way than if we had to actually pull physical objects together. And this is where we start to encounter some themes that are a little more obviously antithetical to how Jupiter rolls, and that is that, the activities of Gemini aren't necessarily directed towards a greater goal. It's exploring and theorizing and experimenting just for the fun of it, just for the novelty, to see what happens if, right? Jupiter, especially in Sagittarius, is also a mutable sign, so, it's dealing with this, a little bit of this, a little bit of that, but Sagittarius wants to bring a little bit of this and a little bit of that into, one of these and make it go somewhere. Sagittarius always needs a goal, and they often become quite lost and sad when they don't have one. Gemini is perfectly content to not have a single unifying goal for things. It's perfectly content to have a little bit of this over here and a little bit of that over there. And we can see what happens if they combine, but we don't need to commit ourselves to anything, right? That would be too serious. While Sagittarius is interested in bringing together the many to become one, Gemini likes to pull things apart and explore the differences between things, and how we can even achieve, new and different reactions by playing with people's expectations, right? You thought I was going to shake your hand, but actually I have a little buzzer in my hand, right? Gotcha. Gemini is interested in tricks and sort of techniques. It's to do things in cool and nifty ways and get, different reactions out of people. Gemini's exploration of duality and contradiction, as well as the speed with which it tends to move through chains of possibility, ultimately lead it to paradoxical interactions, which Gemini delights in endlessly, while Sagittarius might freak the fuck out. The, unsolvability and irrelevance, meaninglessness of a paradox defies the, Jupiterian impulse to make things coherent, make things make sense. Gemini is as interested in things that make sense as things that don't. Things that don't make sense can be quite interesting and amusing. I enjoy them from time to time. But overall, we, can start to see how there might be a little bit of tension between Jupiter and its relationship with Gemini. We might have to deal with some things that kind of bum it out and that it doesn't really know how to work with properly. Nonetheless, we can't really understand how Jupiter operates in Gemini without also understanding the ways in which Gemini supports Jupiter. And as we enter the sign of Gemini and we start looking at the minor dignities, such as the bound rulership and decanic rulership, these little subplots of Gemini, we can kind of get a sense that, like, maybe this is not a big deal for Jupiter. It's a little awkward. Jupiter's a philosophy major, hanging out with a bunch of math nerds and fingerboarders, jugglers, and people of a, more mercurial disposition. The Gemini kids want to joke around, play games, gossip, and, may not always appreciate Jupiter's attempts to philosophize and moralize and maybe try to corral all these nerds together and get them to, do a group activity. But Jupiter, can adjust, can fit in. And in the first 10 degrees of Gemini, Jupiter has a sort of special role, even as one of the primary methods of assigning decanic rulership assigns the first decan of Gemini to Jupiter. You might imagine that this initial experiment in splitting ones into twos and twos into fours, of dividing, is also a form of multiplication, of growth, of expansion, which Jupiter can totally get down on. As we start to accumulate an ever-growing body of facts and data points in the first decan, we can see how Jupiter's capacity to make, more coherent wholes out of the many could be quite welcome, and also support the kind of Gemini initiative of creating new, different, combinations of things. If you take 20 things, make them into one thing, you have a whole new thing that can be further split into, new variations, right? Jupiter likes this game. And Jupiter also likes to teach. Part of any body of wisdom is a knowledge of how, things work on a more ground level, how things interact with each other. And all these, tiny understandings can start to coalesce into, grander narratives, which we can get, bachelor's, master's, PhDs in, and, disseminate that information back out to other people. So if we imagine the signs as places which, support the planets in different ways, but also react to the planet's activities in different ways, we see a side of Gemini that welcomes Jupiter's capabilities, if only, a particular subset. And this, sort of friendliness towards Jupiter continues to be emphasized even outside of this first 10 degree slice, as at least the bound extends out to the 13th degree Gemini, edging into this second decan, which is, initially fairly welcoming, and then kind of less so, the second decan of Gemini, which is ruled by Mars and by Venus. And the activities shift away from the very intellective Jupiter and Mercury ruled first decan. Mars and Venus are, nighttime planets, which are more interpersonal, which are more social, and more physical. Venus is about, enjoying stuff, having stuff, the pleasure of interacting with stuff, while Mars is about, messing stuff up. This is where we start to take some of the theoretical concepts that were developed in the first decan of Gemini and start to give them form, give them bodies. And we start to explore the sort of sensual results, the, both destructive and pleasurable ways in which opposites can interact. And, mythologically, it's interesting that Mars and Venus always had the hots for each other, but were also always married to other people, never to each other. So they were always cheating on their partners in order to be together, in sort of blatant defiance of these matches that Zeus had set up, right? The sort of moral order that Jupiter or Zeus represents is not, welcome in this place where Mars and Venus fuck around. They want to do their thing, and they don't want Jupiter, telling them what they should or shouldn't do. And as, things get more physical in this part of Gemini, the consequences start to ratchet up. They start to become more impactful and potentially, damaging. And while, Gemini has many, many virtues, super fun, super smart, great at seeing things from multiple perspectives, what it is not, though, is moralizing, interested in morality, really at all. That doesn't mean that if you have lots of Gemini placements, you are amoral, but you are probably more likely to be capable of taking on the perspective of, a different sort of moral construct. Sagittarius doesn't like it so much when we start to question the moral reasons for doing things, when we start using logic to rationalize, what from the Sagittarian perspective is amoral behavior. We might say from Gemini 2's perspective, Mars and Venus, they got the hots for each other. What's wrong with them having a good time? Are they really hurting anybody? I mean, they might be hurting people's feelings, but that's just because they got these, outdated moral ideas about what people should or shouldn't do, trying to, constrain our exploration of possibility, right? If the rules say that we're not allowed to try this thing that seems like it could be really fun, that's really lame. And that's something that people with placements in the second decan of Gemini will be likely to encounter in one form or another. Surprisingly often shows up in the form of relationship dynamics, entering into relationships that, move outside of conventionally accepted formats. But there's also plenty of ways we can find ourselves pushing against institutionalized ways of thinking, ways of doing things that shake up the status quo, and often upset the Jupiter folk, the privileged few who benefit from the stability in order to form something new, something maybe freer and oftentimes, a little sexier, right? That's Mars-Venus decan. The way the bounds line up in Gemini has an interesting intersection with the decanic rulership. The first bound is ruled by Mercury, the second by Jupiter, and the third by Venus. It's not Jupiter, but it's potentially kind of harmless, right? It's still, benefic. We're doing things for love, for joy. And it's unfortunate they push against certain moral systems, but often it's for, the greater good, and facilitates the harmonizing of tensions, which obviously exist. Moral structures have a way of separating people on their own as well. Even in Sagittarius, if you have an inside cohesive whole, you got outsiders. But it would be a damn shame for antiquated concepts like barbarians, heathens, and fornicators to, get in the way of a good time, or two people that love each other, right? But then we move into the fourth bound of Gemini, which is Mars ruled, and covers the last 3 degrees of the second decan of Gemini, and moves into the third, where maybe, the side of pushing back against moral constructs might have a little more emphasis. That's not to say that some intellective constructs do not need to be eviscerated mercilessly, but it sometimes has negative consequences for somebody, obviously. In war, even in just war, which Gemini is, it can justify if it needs to. It can take on a perspective. But, there's winners and losers, right? There's people who benefit, there's people who suffer, and it doesn't really matter if one was good in a moralistic sense or one was bad. It just happens for, often very calculable reasons. One side had more than the other one. So we might imagine Jupiter getting a little more frustrated moving into this bound. Maybe feeling a little more embattled. Needing to hold on to, a belief system that is not, supported by the amoral heathens around them, right? Or, could find itself on one side or the other, and have to struggle with what is often the case with most conflicts, is that there isn't necessarily a good or bad side. At the end of the day, fighting for one side is still fighting. Fighting for one side doesn't necessarily serve the greater good of humanity any more than the other one. And, actually both, are kind of destructive. That's the kind of situation that would really bum Jupiter out, especially as we start to move into the third decan of Gemini, which is ruled by the Sun and by Saturn, and things sort of reach a boiling point. The debates and arguments about this side or that side or this one or that one come to a point where we just have to pick one. We have to pick a side. In Gemini 2, we might get to straddle a fence. Gemini 2 people sometimes like to have their cake and eat it too, right? But in third decan of Gemini, if you eat the cake, you ate the cake. It's gone. This is where things get decisive and final and much more consequential. This is a Sun-Saturn decan. This is like the death of kings kind of shit. This is the overthrowing of empires. Clandestine espionage shit. Stakes, are really high. And we start to see Jupiter get really uncomfortable because it's forced to choose between sides. It can't, maintain unity. It can't hold the opposing forces together. And it's not necessarily always an easy choice. Jupiter might have a hard time sleeping at night either way, because both choices, forced it to compromise on its ideals, right? And then we arrive at the Saturn-ruled bound of Gemini, the last fifth bound, which comprises, about the last 6 degrees of Gemini, where we're really actually eliminating possibility, reducing it all the way down to 1. And when the plane crashed and we all drew straws, and Jerry drew the short straw, and then next week, Martha drew the short straw, and poor old Jupiter found itself with the fortune of being the sole survivor, having eaten its entire friends. How does Jupiter live with itself at the end of that ordeal? Some real tough stuff to find meaning in, find the meaning of, and things like that can only be, rationally concluded to just be accidents of fortune. The great cosmic hand reached into the pile of possibility of possible sacrifices, and it picked baby Gerald. Sorry, it's dark, but it's kind of a dark decan. It's not fun anymore by the time we get to the third decan of Gemini, unless you enjoy really high risk, high stakes things like infiltrating, being a double agent in Cold War Germany and having to play both sides, and you start regretting maybe having explored some of those possibilities. What started out as fun and games has ended in tears. And I think the thing that we have to remember is that Jupiter has some dignity in all of Gemini through triplicity. And all this sort of seemingly random, interesting Gemini stuff that happens, often we do want someone to do the hard work of making it mean something, even if it's just a story that we tell ourselves. I think few people could argue that some religions might have been brought into being by a true prophet that had a straight mainline connection to the big guy upstairs, but some were just things that people made up for nefarious reasons, or just to feel like there was a point. And I think that's part of Jupiter's role in Gemini, is to act as a kind of opposition party within Gemini. To, remind everybody in their nifty explorations and experiments that there should be a point, right? If we're having to dip outside of conventional morality and do things that hurt people or that are of ambiguous benefit to people as a whole, that we're going to do that, there has to be a point to it. Jupiter is traditionally in detriment in Gemini for a reason. The sign as a whole kind of bums Jupiter out. Some parts of it has more fun things to do than others, but ultimately it has to kind of play that role of trying to forgive the children who know not what they do, right? Trying to guide people that don't want to listen and redeem the seemingly arbitrary, random acts of, cruelty and stuff that we do find in Gemini, right? It's like all signs has a dark side. So while, Jupiter's time in Gemini might not be a great time for Jupiter, we might benefit from its influence in terms of the affairs of Gemini, right? I think it's good timing when we're dealing with a proliferation of very advanced technologies, which could potentially disrupt the way civilization is structured on a huge scale. We're talking about AI, right? It's potentially game-changing, and very openly conceptualized as potentially having the capacity to destroy humanity, right? If the AI goes intelligent, or people might lose jobs, but we have to do it, right? Because we're people and we have brains that want to go down that road. See what happens if it can be done. If we could make AI, could we not? And Jupiter may not be able to stop us from doing it, but he might, be able to rein in these sort of maybe short-sighted efforts that move us forward in terms of technological progress, but push us towards more dangerous outcomes for humanity as a whole.
So here's our Jupiter in Gemini avatar. I think this one was actually a very fun discovery for me to go under, because the album came out a few weeks ago. It came out on this beautiful Friday. I think Venus was in Taurus. It was a Venus day. It was such a good time, and I listened to this album and I immediately fell in love with it. But I didn't really think that this would be such a good example for Jupiter and Gemini as it actually was. What's happening is that I went to Norwalk very recently, and I was just listening to the album. For those of you who don't know, Jupiter ingressed Gemini just as Norwalk was unfolding, and so that was very interesting. Just as Jupiter and Gemini was entering the sign, I was listening to this album. I went on a nice walk just to get some energy out and kind of just get acclimated to the environment. And it just kind of dawned on me, hey, hold on. A lot of the songs in this album are actually very illustrative of Jupiter and Gemini and what Jupiter and Gemini can come to represent. And so I was lucky enough to find Willow's birth data, and turns out that we actually have a AA chart for Willow, which means that we actually have the exact time and date and location of where she was born. And when I looked at the chart, I was like, oh my gosh, this is crazy. Because if there is ever a Jupiter in Gemini avatar, if that's ever a thing, I think Willow is a very good example of that. I think what was very interesting is I was actually looking into the exact degree placement that Jupiter was in her chart. The thing that's really interesting about that is that she has Jupiter at 9 degrees of Gemini, which is, as you can see in the picture over here, it falls under Jupiter's Decan and also under Jupiter's terms, which tends to kind of soothe a little bit of the detriment that we've been talking about with Jupiter being in Gemini. I think that those areas of Gemini, because it has so much of Jupiter in that, can even resemble a little bit of that Jupiter in Sagittarius sort of quality. Even listening to Willow and looking at the style that she went with, all the music videos and all of the colors and the album art and just the textures and the visual representation of the music kind of have this sort of bright and explosive Sagittarian-like quality. But I think where we get the Gemini is that some of these pieces are somewhat, like a word that we used earlier in this video, is that they are somewhat paradoxical. They feel like they wouldn't really fit together, but somehow she makes it work in a very nice way. And I think that that's one of the gifts of Jupiter and Gemini. Can really unify these sort of different things, like things that don't belong. Somehow Jupiter and Gemini natives might have this ability to make them work somehow, or things that maybe people think that are strange or out there to a Jupiter and Gemini native like Willow can be just another tool or just another color in the palette that she got to use. And I think that that's very evident in her album. But I think that the thing that got me even more interested in Willow's chart was actually looking at the timing of it all, because a lot of us in the astrology space are already very familiar with this. Like when we look at a chart, yes, we have all these placements and they're all active. They're all part of a person's makeup. But there are times in our lives where a certain placement might become more important than a different placement. And of course, Jupiter and Gemini rising is a strong enough placement that it probably is one of those things that kind of permeates all the aspects of Willow's life. But I think when we also get those timing hits, things get even more evident. And I think that that's what's happening right now. The reason why I say that is because after getting Willow's birth chart, I was very curious to look at what was going on as she was writing this album. And why is that this album feels so much like a Jupiter and Gemini story, or something that can help us understand Jupiter and Gemini. And whenever I'm looking at the timing of a chart, the place that I always start is with the Fordaria periods. I noticed that just in October 31st of 2020, Willow entered her Jupiter Fardar. So she entered this larger period of Jupiter, and then just recently in July 19th of 2022, she entered a Jupiter Mars period in her chart. Jupiter periods are like Jupiter. They're about expansion, cohesion, having the people that you need at your disposal so you can take a project or take some sort of vision forward. Because I think that Jupiter, being a diurnal planet, really has to do with this more forward sort of thing about manifesting, if you will, rather than receiving or being in a more passive sort of state. Especially Jupiter in Gemini, which is a masculine sign or a yang sign or a dominant sign, will really bring some of those like, let's go and let's do it and let's do it this all together. It was interesting even to look at some interviews that Willow had about this album and how she said that the writing process was very much a collaborative thing.
So Chris Griotti is a really good friend of mine. We made Coping Mechanism together, and we made a few songs on this record together. The way that me and Chris work most of the time is we have an amazing drummer friend named Asher Banks, and he will just play for a super long time. He'll play different BPMs, different, time signatures, different everything. And he'll go away and we'll come together and listen to everything that he did and be like, we like this part, we like this part, we like this part. And so the drum part was picked first, and then right after that we did the bass. I had been telling my good homie Chris Griotti that I'm like, no electric guitar on the album. Like, I want it to be super stripped back. I want it to be super raw. What's interesting about this song is that this was the first song that we actually added some electric guitar to. I just was like, you know what? F it. We're going for it, because I wanted to give it that funky, like, kind of dark feeling. I wanted it to feel like you're on the verge of a panic attack.
And one of the things that is also very interesting about Mars being part of this story is that Mars in her chart is the ruler of the 11th sign, or the 11th place. Mars as the ruler of the 11th sign does bring certain connotations about collaboration, helpful people, assistance from higher places, and all sorts of things like that. The 11th house is a place of community, and she created this album in a very communal way, which I found to be very interesting. The way that I like to work with Fordaria is that it paints the larger picture. We know that Jupiter in her chart is rising, so a large story of this Jupiter period for her would be for her to realize herself as a person, because it's the planet that's conjunct the ascendant, and so it really has a lot to do with who she is. But I think that also looking into the other periods really highlights how important this album actually might be in the achievement of creating this solid persona for Willow, because I think a lot of people know Willow from Whip My Hair Back and Forth, that song that came out when she was probably 14 or something like that. But now she's really coming into a much more mature sound, and I think that being in this Jupiter Fardar period where it has so much to do with herself and her image is really telling something here. But anyways, so we talked about how she is in this Fardar period, which is ruled by both Jupiter and Mars. We're also talked about how Jupiter in her chart really represents her, but also represents her partners, as Jupiter rules her 7th house, which is the house of partnerships. Mars in her chart is associated with the 11th house of friends, allies, hopes, and goals, and even like the profits that comes from your career endeavors. All those things go into the 11th house, but also is responsible for the 6th sign, which is a place of toil, hard work, sometimes even health issues. And I think that that's also something that some of those themes were also explored in Willow's album. Mars is also in the 4th sign in Willow's chart, which is the house of foundations. It's like the ground that we stand on. And I think that this really goes to show how formative this album might be in Willow's career as she keeps going forth.
I truly believe that this album is my first grown-up album. Okay. This album for me doesn't feel like I'm arriving somewhere. It feels like I'm settling into a path that I've always wanted to find and I always knew was there. But now I'm just trusting that, like, oh no, this is the path.
The reason why I'm spending some time talking about her timeline is that by studying a person who is so Jupiter and Gemini, we can learn how that transit might pan out in our lives. And I think even using Willow's album, since it portrays so many of these themes as a way to get in the zone of the Jupiter and Gemini and how you feel after listening to the album, or how you relate to the themes of the songs, can really help elucidate a sense of understanding about this transit for you, even without all of the technical astrology things. I think with my astrology, I'm always pro exploring astrology outside of the astrology techniques themselves, even though I'm spending a lot of time on these astrology techniques. But anyways, so we talked about for Daria, but one thing that kept showing up in all of these Willow charts is how important Jupiter actually is. So Willow is now in her 24th year, and this is the chart for her solar return. So for you who might not know what a solar return is, it's essentially the chart of your birthday. It doesn't always happen in the day of your birthday, but it's the chart of when the sun has returned to the exact spot in the sky that it was when you were born. That's essentially the idea. When the sun returns to that same spot, we cast a new chart, and that chart tells us about that year and the quality of the year. This is a thing that I do in my charts because one thing that I'm always interested in working with timing is trying to find the common denominator. Like, what is the planet that is most in charge of this chart at this time? And if you remember, we just looked at Willow's Ferdaria periods, and the Ferdaria period said that Jupiter and Mars would be relevant. And then here again in her solar return chart, we see that she has a Sagittarius rising, which is a sign that is ruled by Jupiter. And we see that Jupiter and Mars are actually opposite one another, with Jupiter in Taurus and Mars in Scorpio, kind of really further emphasizing that Mars and Jupiter are really important players. And like I said, Mars and Jupiter in Willow's chart are really coming to represent herself, her partnerships, her creative endeavors, and also the associations and the networks that she's making along the way. To me, seeing how Jupiter is in the 6th house of this solar return chart really shows how much work she might actually have had to go through to make this album be realized.
I've tried to run away from it. I've tried to be like, no, I'm not a musician. I'm gonna do something else. And then guess what? It just keeps on coming back.
on the door.
And so that's how you know, like, something is really important to you. If it causes you pain and discomfort and you're still wanting to do it, you know, that's like, okay, like, I trust that inner drive.
Jupiter is here at 10 degrees of Taurus, trine to the midheaven at 18 degrees of Virgo, while Venus is also right at the top of the sky with the midheaven. To me, seems like this year. So from Willow's 2023 birthday to her next birthday in 2024 would be a year of creative work and intense creative work. It's also interesting to think about how Jupiter in this chart is in Taurus, which is her 12th house. One thing that she really explored in this album were issues with mental health, which is one of the topics that goes really hand in hand with the 12th house. To add to that, there's another technique that helps us narrow down the focus of a year or the topics of a year. The reason why we're applying these techniques is to really get to the bottom of whether Willow's album, Empathogen, is a good example of a Jupiter and Gemini sort of vibe or energy. Can we really use this album to learn about Jupiter and Gemini? Or is it more one of those things where it's kind of like, oh yeah, it sort of sounds like Jupiter and Gemini, but it's not born out of that sort of configuration. But as we're seeing now, Jupiter and Gemini keeps popping up time and time again. So the next technique that I ran her chart through was annual Profections, and most people are familiar with this technique nowadays. Essentially what the technique, as far as most people know, is that every year the ascendant of your chart moves a house over. So in your first year of life, your ascendant will be in the 1st house. Then when you have your next birthday, the ascendant would go to the 2nd house, and then the 3rd house, and then the 4th and 5th, and so on and so forth. And then every 12 years, that cycle would reset. What a lot of people don't realize is that this technique is not only focused on the ascendant, and it's also not really focused on the house. You can do that same moving a sign forward to every single point and every single planet in the chart. One of the things that I thought is very helpful is actually perfecting some of the most important parts of a natal chart. And those are very familiar to most people, which are the sun, the moon, and the rising. But also I go as far as to add the lot of fortune as well, which represents important events, or like the winds of fate as they hit your chart left, right, and center. And it's really one of those placements that become really important in timing. And since we're doing a timing technique, I think it's really important to add it in there. So as you can see over here, her ascendant is in Gemini, like we've been talking about. The 12th house of Gemini is Taurus. And so for that year, her ascendant is in quote unquote Taurus. But then because she has Jupiter in Gemini as well, Jupiter will also come to Taurus, which is interesting because Jupiter is transiting through Taurus, as she probably wrote and also as she released the album. Other placements would be the moon, which is the primary luminary of her chart because she was born during the night. Her moon natally is in Capricorn, but then this year the moon comes to Sagittarius, which is a Jupiter-ruled sign. Her sun also is originally in Scorpio. The 12th house from Scorpio is Libra, which is a Venus-ruled sign. But one thing that people sometimes overlook is that all the air signs are also ruled by Jupiter to a certain degree. So yet again, even though we're talking about Venus, we still have a sort of jovial vibe that comes with topics related to her sun in her life. And topics related to the sun would be energy, vitality, creativity also can go in there, like your public persona, like the you that's out and about in the world. Over here, we also see that fortune then moves to Pisces, which is yet again another Jupiter sign. And her ascendant, like we said, moves to Taurus, which doesn't seem like it is a particularly Jupiter place. But if we look over here, we see that in her solar return, so the chart of her birthday, she actually had Jupiter at 10 degrees Taurus, which is where her perfected ascendant actually moves from. So Jupiter, again, shows up in this area of life. So all of this to say that Jupiter is a huge player in Willow's chart across all these different topics. So topics related to the moon, which would be her body, but also her wanderings in life, anything to do with her comfort in life. Her mother also could be implied by the moon. The sun, like I said, it's her public persona, energy, her vitality, the things that she's creating, the things that her life force is kind of like moving towards. Fortune, which would be fated events in her life, kind of have this Jupiter flavor, or Jupiter has the say on how those fated events go. And then the ascendant, as is herself, like who she is also having this Jupiter flavor, even though she has that Jupiter flavor to begin with, because Jupiter is close to her ascendant. All this is saying to me is that whatever Willow did this year will have this Jupiter flavor. And her natal Jupiter is in Gemini, so that also by extension means that whatever Willow is doing this year has this Jupiter and Gemini flavor. One of the things that I thought was very intriguing too is that I went to look at her Jupiter transits, all the Jupiter transits that would be happening within the year that the techniques are saying that Jupiter will be important. And it just so happens that within this year, she will have a Jupiter return. So very similar to the solar return, this is Jupiter going back to exactly the same spot that it was when Willow was born. So in many ways, we can read this as the reset of the Jupiter cycle for Willow. Like whatever Jupiter comes to represent in her chart is having this sort of new mood phase. We're like resetting this whole thing. One of the things that come with Jupiter is awards, liberation, freedom, and the ability to succeed and thrive and all those sorts of things. So with Jupiter and Gemini returning to that spot, especially in the first house, it can be that on July 4th, which actually is actually a very interesting day for her to have that return. There could be some sort of event that really brings some of those qualities out into her life. Because Jupiter also rules both her career and her partners, it could be that maybe she wins some sort of a partnership deal at around that time or something along those lines. It could also be an award because Jupiter is the ruler of her 10th, which is her career persona, like the person that she is in her work, or the person that she is when everybody is looking at her. So I think July 4th is an interesting day to pay attention to Willow's life, to see if maybe there's something there that we can learn about what Jupiter and Gemini can manifest when it's doing important things to a person's chart. As we're recording this today, it is June 2nd, so there's still some time that needs to unfold for us to be sure, but I would definitely be on the lookout to see what comes out. But, alright, so we talked about this Jupiter, and so I wanted to look at the actual chart of the album itself, because if the charts and the timing techniques are pointing to Willow this year making some sort of like big career move, really leaving her mark in the music industry, it would be really interesting to look at the chart of the album. But the thing with albums nowadays is that all albums are released at midnight on the day that they're supposed to be released, kind of like on a drip, because the album comes out at midnight for everybody. So it's really hard to know exactly when the album comes out. It's not really coming out from a physical location. There's nobody publishing the song. But what I did is that I looked at the date that the album was released, and I rooted it to her natal location because she was born there. And so everything that comes from there, not literally everything, but things that come from there, I think it would just make sense to root it that way. Because then we're tying the chart of the album to her natal chart, and we're comparing and contrasting to see what results we get. I think that rooting it to the nativity does yield some interesting results. The thing that I really wanted to show you with this is that Jupiter shows up as a major player for the album itself. The album was released on May 3rd, 2024, rooted to LA and California. And at that time, we had Sagittarius rising, which is ruled by Jupiter, as we've been talking about. But because this is a midnight release, we also look at the luminary of the chart, which in this case would be the moon, because the album was released at night. And that day, the moon was also in Pisces, which is another Jupiter-ruled sign. So we know that despite Jupiter not being quite yet in Gemini, this album definitely has a Jupiter quality. And the reason why I think that we can still justify this album being relevant to Jupiter and Gemini themes is that Willow, as a Jupiter and Gemini, will express Jupiter in the way that she knows best, which is the way that she is. So this is how we got here. And here are a couple of the examples that I thought were very telling about the Jupiter and Gemini theme. So she has two songs that are very important. One of the major themes that runs through the album is the theme of complexity and the theme of busyness, and especially mental busyness and not really knowing exactly where to go, what to do, or you have many ideas of where to go and what to do, but you just don't know which one is the right one. And then eventually you can get stuck in the sense of overwhelm. And I think that, again, like I was saying earlier, this is very illustrative of Willow being in a 12th house year. The 12th house, like I said, deals with these topics of loss and anguish and loneliness and sometimes mental health issues and all things that are concerned with that. It's also interesting to think about how Willow also is an Algol native, like we've been talking about Algol in this channel for our first video, and she has Saturn Algol conjunct in the 12th house, and I think I can definitely see some of those themes come out also in the way that she explores mental health in this album. There's a lot of the sense of like losing one's head and going crazy and not knowing exactly who you are anymore and really being lost in your own identity even, which is interesting to think about with Jupiter being in Gemini close to her ascendant. It really is this sort of self-portrait of sorts that I thought was really interesting. But this song, the song that I thought was most telling of the Jupiter and Gemini story was this one called Run. The whole story of the song is just trying to use the music and the music video to tell the audience how it feels like to have a panic attack. And so in the music video, Willow is kind of facing herself, her sane person holding on to dear life and her insane person, and trying to run from each other and run towards each other. And it's this sort of paradoxical thing that in the end they reunite, even though throughout the whole music video it seems like they're actually moving apart and trying to be separated. And so again, we have this sort of Jupiter and Gemini paradoxical sort of thing going on. Even like the theme of twins and the twins that live inside one's head are kind of exploring in this.
Stop looking at me as if I'm in front of me, stop talking to me. you in and every word that you say. I'll twist it around and down until I can't recognize you. Give in to intrusive thoughts. Could get me, but oh no, I won't get out. I won't get.
I really think that this music video is a huge example of how the tougher side of Jupiter and Gemini can come out in people's lives. And it'd be interesting to know, even in the comments, if you go and listen to the song and how that makes you feel in relationship to your chart. Because I'm sure there are a lot of you guys watching are already familiar with your chart and you know where Jupiter and Gemini lands in it. So I would be curious to see if some of these themes are popping up in your life. Let me know. The other song in the album that really explores these topics is one called Big Feelings. And this one has really simple lyrics, but I think it's the visualizer that is very interesting. When we talked about things to do to remediate Jupiter and Gemini, one of them was to laugh hysterically. And if you actually watch the visualizer, the running theme is that hysterical laughter, and you can see it on screen right now.
I have such big feelings. Can't shut them down without a sound. Acceptance is the key. Acceptance gives me wings. Acceptance is the key. Acceptance gives me wings.
She is just, throughout the whole entire song, she just goes from being totally unfazed with a plain, like, resting bitch face or almost sort of thing, and out of nowhere she just bursts into this maniacal laughter, and it feels contagious and strange, and it feels forced, but it also feels like she gets into it, and the more that she does it, and I thought that was very interesting. The whole song just talks about having big feelings that you can't shut down, or you don't know how to get them out of yourself in any other way. And I think that pairing that with this sort of maniacal laughter that runs through the entire visualization of the music video is very interesting, because in a way she's kind of showing us how to remediate Jupiter and Gemini. One of the ways that we can remediate Jupiter and Gemini, it might be to just not take all these things so seriously. Like, yes, there's so many different things that could be done, or so many different pathways that could be taken, but in the end, it's not serious. You can kind of just laugh it out and be playful about it. I think that that's one of the things that the song really teaches us through the perspective of a Jupiter and Gemini native. Because even as we listen to the chorus of the song, she says that acceptance is the key and acceptance gives me wings. So I think that if we can take a page out of Willow's book, we can figure out how to navigate this Jupiter and Gemini transit for ourselves. All right, so this was a great Jupiter and Gemini video. We learned who is Jupiter, what is Gemini. We saw a good example of a Jupiter and Gemini native, or even how Jupiter and Gemini could feel like when you're going through a Jupiter and Gemini transit. So with all of that, I think that's all for today, and I hope you enjoyed this episode of the Astrology Channel. As always, I'm Joe G, and this is Kyle Pierce, and if you want to find us, I'm at themercuryrising.com, and Kyle is at
KylePierceAstrologer.com.
guys. I'll see you on the next episode.
Thanks for watching.